Hi everyone, my name's Daryl, and today we're going to talk about the infamous bell housing issue that's common on Nissan GTRs. And I'm so really happy to introduce Wes Hawkins. He's the owner of ATR Performance as well as Highline Auto Care. And Wes, his company, basically has been rebuilding that Nissan created to greatly improve upon its design as well as its durability. So really, really great to meet you, Wes.
Yeah, likewise. Great to meet you.
So my first question basically is on the bell housing issue and, kind of as simply as possible, especially for folks that, maybe are kind of new to the GTR platform, could you kind of talk about the bell housing issue and kind of, you know, why it's a problem and kind of what happens?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll try to keep it simple, but there's kind of a lot to it.
Okay.
Anyone who's new to the platform or maybe not seen underneath the GTR, it's worth notating. You've got your engine up front, you've got the transmission in the back, you've got a drive shaft in between the two. On the back of the engine, we've got a bell housing. You can actually see that bell housing looks like right behind me there.
Okay.
Just a chunk of aluminum with a shaft that runs through it with two bearings on it. And that's what's responsible for transferring the power from the engine to the drive shaft, which does the transmission. And, we've got through the years, Nissan started developing this platform, I think in '08, all the way up to present here. They've had three different revisions in an attempt to fix this very common issue. And when I say very common, pretty much every GTR is going to need a bell housing at some point, some of them sooner than others. However, so on our first two designs that Nissan's put out, we've had an issue where, let me just grab this guy here.
Oh, that's great.
Got
Visuals.
this shaft. Yeah, so I just kind of have some props here just to show you. But
That's perfect.
this guy, it's got the two bearings right here. They're obviously not pressed on right now. This is a shaft that we've modified. But this shaft rides inside of that aluminum housing behind us. In the first two revisions, Nissan just had an aluminum housing, and what would happen is this shaft would be forced over time, just moving back and forth, and would wallow that aluminum housing out. So what we have is this entire assembly is just kind of going like this, flopping around, essentially inside of that housing. Nissan's third revision, they actually put hardened steel sleeves into that aluminum housing that these two bearings would press into. Now that keeps the shaft in place. The hardened steel sleeves do not wear out. However, the bearings that Nissan was using on their third revision tend to fail. So rather than the shaft going like this as you're driving, it's actually moving just very slightly in and out due to the bearings being worn out.
I guess my first question is, do you recall the years of these kind of different generations of bell housings that Nissan did? And does it really matter?
I mean, to me, it doesn't really matter. I don't
Okay.
know when they made the split. I think that their initial version was probably '08 to 10. And then the other two revisions came sometime after that.
Okay. And do you recall if any of them were kind of more durable than the original, or they all kind of failed kind of similarly?
Well, they all fail in the well, and they all fail, I guess. But your first two revisions, like I said, they will wear out the aluminum housing there.
Okay.
And then on the third revision, the bearings get worn out.
Okay. And did you have to make any sort of changes? Because you've got a number of different versions of your bell housing. Did you have to kind of modify things as Nissan kind of made changes to their design of the bell housing, or it didn't really impact you?
Well, on our end, it doesn't really matter what housing we get. We'll modify them the same.
Okay.
Our V1 housing, which we started with about 6 years ago, we simply put hardened steel inserts into the housing and we use a different bearing and assemble it all. That ends up with, kind of an OEM style replacement. We feel that our bearings are a little bit more durable,
Hmm.
um, but you end up kind of with a replacement version that's similar to Nissan's third design, only with a better bearing.
Okay.
On our V2 housings, which we've been running for about 3 years now, we actually modified the shaft and the flange, which we'll probably get into a little bit later, but this greatly reduces the chance of future failure.
Oh, that's great. That's true.
And then, we don't talk about them quite as much. We've got a version 3, version 3.5, and a version 4 housing. Those would all be for anyone who's looking to push, maybe over 1,500 to 1,800 horsepower, all the way up to 3,000 horsepower.
Okay. If I was looking at purchasing a GTR, because that's kind of how my video series started, were, kind of people that were looking at buying a GTR and things that they should look for. What is the common issues that folks would look at if a bell housing might be pretty close to failing?
Yeah, well, kind of a funny aside here is that I talked to hundreds of people who need bell housings, obviously, and I hear time and again the salesman, the customer will say, "Hey, this car is making rattling noises," and the salesman says, "Yeah, it's a GTR. That's what they do." Well, I mean, a lot of them do rattle, but it's not what they're supposed to do. You know, it obviously our first recommendation is if you're buying a used GTR, have a proficient shop inspect it, doing an inspection in the air as well. However, if you happen to be making, a purchase in a parking lot at night, very simple to check for a failed bell housing. Just let the car sit there and idle, and you're going to hear just kind of an inconsistent rattle.
Okay.
Essentially, that shaft just bouncing around inside of the housing.
Okay. And I'll go ahead. On your guys' website, you have kind of like the sound effect of that rattle. So I'll go ahead and add that in, so people can kind of hear that as they're listening to this. Um, let's see. I had a good follow up on that one. Are there things that folks do you think that might cause the bell housing to fail a little bit earlier? Because I've got like a 2012 and I've got 120,000 miles on it, and I still, I don't have that bell housing issue. And others folks, will have it in the first 5,000 miles and they'll have a problem already. What, in your experience, what do you see that kind of causes that failure, or the, I guess, premature failure?
Well, let's just go back to the description of, how the vehicle is set up with an engine in the front, transmission in the back, um, with a drive shaft in the middle. Um, I suspect that some vehicles are a little bit more prone to failure than others just due to the engine and transmission distance between each other. We've kind of determined that what causes these housings to fail is just that constant push and pull between the transmission, and that drive shaft is just banging on the bell housing. So um, I think that's what causes the bearings and the housings to wear out over time, is just being pounded by that. So I think that maybe some vehicles, that distance might be just far enough apart that the drive shaft isn't beating on the bell housing quite as much as it would on another.
Hmm.
That's just a speculation. But that's also kind of why we developed our version 2, was to give that drive shaft a little bit more room to float between the engine and transmission. You could compare, there's other manufacturers that put the transmission in the back, like the Corvette, for example. And they actually have a solid torque tube that holds the engine and transmission in an exact distance apart, the drive shaft running through the middle. Now, if the GTR had something like that, I don't suspect we would have nearly as many bell housing failures.
Do you have any sort of insight into why kind of Nissan hasn't made a change in the original design to kind of solve that issue?
I don't. That's why we started making them, I suppose.
So you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I I guess specifically, what is it that you do in your design that helps with the rattle as well as the premature kind of failure?
Well, like as I said, without giving too much away here, is we've taken the shaft and the flange and modified it, just to give that drive shaft a little bit of room to float, so it's not constantly pounding on the bell housing there.
Okay.
I guess to go back to your question, what might cause a premature failure aside from the vehicle itself? Because I think that launching the vehicle, and then also aggressive driving. Maybe you're doing road course or autocross type of driving. I think that's causing a lot of shift in the torque front to back
Hmm.
in both cases. We've had some people have told me they threw a brand new Nissan bell housing in and the thing failed within 5 launches.
Wow.
So I think that's got a lot to do with it.
You've got a number of different versions of the bell housing, and you've been basically offering version 1 of the bell housing for how long now?
Version one, I developed that when I purchased my 2010 that had a bad bell housing. And it's been about 6 years we've been selling that product.
Wow.
Um, version one, we've probably sold 400 or 500 bell housings.
Do you still have that 2010?
I do, yeah, yeah.
So so how much horsepower is it up to now?
Just a little bit over 2,000 now. It's never enough.
Wow, that's amazing. Um, so is that why you're building the version 4 Sweden? What do you call that? The version 4 of your product?
Well, so the version four, we don't actually build.
Okay.
Matt Sweden is a machining company in Sweden who
Okay.
machines these parts. So they had a really nice design on a full billet bell housing. Um, and it's really kind of strange because I had it in the back of my mind that we were going to develop this housing. And they rolled it out, and it was exactly what I had in my head that we wanted to roll out. And
Okay.
I was a little bit upset, but I guess at the end of the day, it saved me some brain damage. Now we just work together. Um, but the really cool part about the billet housing, our V4, the Mad Sweden housing, is that it's a two-piece housing. So you've got the large piece that bolts onto the back of the engine, but then you've got the rear piece that has the bearings and the shaft in, and it unbolts from that.
Oh, wow.
It's also a lot narrower, so you have less clearance issues when you start getting in the bigger turbos. Items start to run into the bell housing there as you bolt everything up.
Hmm.
So that billet housing gives you a little bit more room for that, but then also the really cool thing is that you can unbolt the rear section and replace the bearings without having to drop the engine or remove your turbos or downpipes.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I think that was one of my questions was about, being able to service it without, it being, too difficult. So that's interesting that that version 4 actually lets you do some of those things. That's cool.
Right.
Will they still eventually fail the bell housing, or is it kind of something that's kind of more or less kind of bulletproof?
Well, nothing lasts forever, unfortunately. I think over the years, though, we found that, over 6 years, probably 5% or less of a failure rate on our V1s. And over the past 3 years, I would say probably like a 2 to 3% failure rate.
Okay.
Um, the really cool thing about our V2s, and that's another reason that the V2 is a lot more popular, is that we warranty the bearings on them for 5 years.
Okay.
So the bearings would, on our housings, it's typically just the bearings that would fail. We don't
Okay.
have the aluminum housing failure because of the sleeves we put in.
Okay.
So if you buy that V2 and it fails in 4 years, we don't cover labor unless we're installing it in-house. But get that housing removed, send it to us, and we will replace the bearings free of charge.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's like, it seems like most of the um, kind of the trouble points of the GTR, there were some kind of sort of transmission issues and, this bell housing issue. But it's now, these kind of third party folks are, fixing these issues that make, living with the GTR a little bit more more palatable, I guess you could say. So you can, yeah.
Yeah, bell housings and transmissions seem to be the common failure theme on GTRs.
So what is the cost for your different units?
Also, our V1 is 975. Our V2 is 1375. V3 and 4. I don't recall off the top of my head, but
Okay. Okay.
um, any one of the versions, we give you the option to prepay an $800 core charge, which will allow you to get your replacement housing before you send us your old one.
Okay.
So that's going to eliminate your downtime on the lift there. Purchase it, pay the core charge, get the old one back to us, and we'll refund that $800.
Okay. Okay. Do your shop does the installation services as well?
Yeah, so we're a full service maintenance and repair facility. In fact, that's our day to day.
Okay.
Highline Car Care, obviously, morning right now. But we have a little bit of a passion with the Nissan GTRs, so we'll do upgrades, full builds, and all that stuff. Just a side note, one thing with us is we'll only take on one build at a time. So
Okay.
if you're in for a build, your car is getting our full attention and it's not stacked up with 10, 12, 20 other
Hmm.
builds.
Hmm. Nice. I guess one of the questions I had was because I've seen a couple of videos about folks installing bell housings, and for somebody like me that doesn't know anything about this stuff, it just seems really, um, it's a lot. And, I asked my GTR dealer about, what they would charge to do a bell housing replacement. And it was like $2,500 for the actual bell housing, and it was $5,000 to, to install it. And so, um, and so I think on your side it's around 1250 or 1275 to install the thing. So is there some sort of, I guess, performance modification folks that you're familiar with that you commonly ship your bell housing upgrades to, that kind of is familiar with your kind of installation process, that can do so without kind of dropping the engine? Or because it would be difficult. Well, maybe it wouldn't be, but I think it would be difficult for me to find a shop, to take this on necessarily. If, and luckily I'm close to Arizona, so I could just drive on down and see you. But I don't know if I was in other parts of the country, perhaps there was, a performance shop that is a speed shop that knows a lot about GTRs that would do it. But I wondered if you kind of have a list of folks that you kind of deal with.
Yeah, I mean, we've probably got a dozen of the performance shops around the country
Okay.
who all our product, and several of them who actually stock them on their shelves.
Okay. Okay.
It's a pretty good network. If you've ever got a question on your side of the country, definitely shoot us a message. We can put you in touch with someone.
Okay. Well, that's terrific. Thanks. Thank you very much for that. So what about just not repairing it all? It's something that, maybe I can live with. I can put a big exhaust in and kind of drown out the rattle of the bell housing, or turn up the stereo really loud. Are there any sort of ramifications for not actually doing anything and just living with it?
So to this day, we've never seen a failed bell housing cause any additional damage,
Okay.
which I guess is kind of a good thing, right?
Yeah.
We've seen a couple bell housings where the actual housing has just completely shattered, or on the other end of the drive shaft on the front case of the transmission has grenaded, but this is typically due to a very high performance vehicle and it's not
Okay.
related to the bell
Okay.
housing itself failing.
Okay.
So, yeah, if you got that rattle there and it doesn't drive you bananas, it's probably not going to hurt anything. If you've got it on your radar that maybe you're going to take the engine out and put bigger turbos in next year or whenever that might be, you're going to save a whole lot of labor doing the bell housing at the same time.
Okay. Oh, I remember what that question was that I was going to ask you. So in regards to that rattle, um, do you hear it all the time? Or is it more noticeable kind of after the car is warmed up and you can hear it, and it's mostly at idle that you hear it? Is there any sort of differences?
You're typically going to hear it at idle. Once you
Okay.
start driving, it's not really noticeable. Warm versus cold. I would say you're probably going to hear it more when it's warm because the idles drop down a little bit, and it's just the noise is more prominent once the engine's quieted down.
Do you hear it all the time, or like, can you put it in neutral? Does that do anything with that rattle? Does it like disengage anything, or does you'll still hear it?
Yeah, the rattle might shift a little bit between, drive, reverse, or neutral, but
Okay,
just due to the design of the vehicle, that drive shaft is spinning anytime the engine's running. It
okay,
doesn't matter if you're in gear or neutral.
okay, okay. Yeah, so let's say we just have a slightly modified GTR, 700 horsepower or so. What version of the bell housing would you recommend?
The version 2 by far is the most popular unit. I mean, we probably sell 20 of those to any other version. And the cool thing is you can throw the version 2 on a stock car. You can throw it on a car up to 1800 horsepower, and it's still going to perform about the same.
Okay,
And plus, you get that 5-year warranty on the bearings. So that's kind of
okay,
a,
that's really nice. Kind of
yeah.
takes the worry out of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know about the different redesigns of the of the bell housing and the fact that Nissan tried to make multiple attempts at fixing it without success. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering why they just didn't look at what you're doing.
I don't know. Maybe they'll call us someday.
Or call the Sweden guy.
Yeah.
Because I think that's really ingenious separating the two out. I think that's kind of almost that's an interesting way of approaching it, for sure. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it cuts the labor probably in half if you had to service the bearings.
yeah. So that race that you were running, was that like a big? The stands were packed, but I didn't really actually look into the what kind of race this was. Was it just for GTRs, or was there different classifications, or?
Yeah, so we just got back from TX2K, which is a big race in Texas that's been running since 2000. That's where the name came from. And it has kind of become the Super Bowl of drag racing for specific vehicles. I mean, it started out with a Toyota Supra. You still see some of those out there, but now we've got GTRs, we've got twin turbo Audi R8s, twin turbo Huracans. And then they've got an exhibition class where you just get all sorts of crazy cars. And there were, it's quite an experience. There were probably over 10,000, probably close to 20,000 people in the stands watching us race,
That is amazing.
in addition to it being televised. So it's kind of a cool experience.
So tell me how did you perform then? Did you have some good runs?
Well, so did really well in qualifying. Anytime we go to these races, there's always someone who's faster. There's always someone with more money. So I show up to hit my goal. We hit our goal last year of breaking into the sevens on a stock crank engine. And this year, we after last year, we took engine, transmission, turbos, fuel system out and kind of started over. And the goal was to run a 7.5 second quarter mile, which we hit this year in qualification. We did really well, hit a 7:57 at 187 miles an hour. Um, but when it came to eliminations, I kind of got in my head about it, tried to turn it up a little bit too much, and the car didn't like it. So
Oh no.
we got eliminated first round, but it
Oh
was
no.
still fun.
Was that your 2010?
Yeah, the black 2010.
Oh, that's awesome. You didn't break anything, did you?
No, no, no. Drove it right
Okay.
back on the trailer, and we're going racing this weekend. So
All right. All right. Well, Wes, hey, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I'm sure, a lot of folks will find this very interesting. And yeah, if I ever hear that rattle, I'm sure at some point I will. If my GTR lives long enough, I'll probably definitely hear it. I'll be heading down to see you.
we'll be here.
Okay. All right. You have a good afternoon.
You as well. Thanks, Daryl.
Okay. Bye.
I've seen a lot of change, been through a lot of pain. Some things are not the same as they were a year ago, but all will be okay. I move on each and every day. The past is where it stays, way back a year ago.